Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Kurdish minorities in several Middle Eastern countries have never been close to fulfilling their historical dream of creating a Kurdistan, which will inevitably mean cutting territories out of nations currently with sovereignty over them. But they keep trying, and by the same measure, those nations are resisting Kurdish efforts. None more so than Turkey, which has often raided Kurdish enclaves in neighboring Syria and Iraq in order to degrade the power of what it considers terror groups bent on striking within Turkey. Over the last 2 months, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan ordered such spring operations twice, first in Iraq and now in Syria. And what are the aims and implications of these cross-border moves, and how are they impacting Ankara's relationships with Moscow, Washington, and regional capitals? To analyze this, we are joined from Istanbul, Turkey by Mr. Yusuf Erim, who is TRT World's editor-at-large. Thank you for joining us, Yusuf.
Thanks for having me.
Also joining us from Ankara, Turkey, is Ömer Eskizilcik, who is a foreign policy and security analyst. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
Thanks for having me.
And with me in the studio is our TV7 editor-at-large and host of TV7 Watchmen Talk, Powers in Play, and so much more, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us a broader understanding on the latest developments pertaining to Turkey's southern concerns and also proactive actions to stem those concerns.
So Turkey obviously has several, perhaps many, foreign policy and national security concerns. But the Kurdish one is unique because it is both a foreign and domestic problem. There is, of course, a Kurdish minority within Turkey, and there are Kurdish terrorists operating within Turkey. But there are also the organizations which you referred to across the border, and they, of course, pose a problem because they can use Iraq and Syria as safe havens from which to strike into Turkey. So Erdogan, surveying the strategic landscape, obviously saw as of late February and into March and now April and May and even June, that he has more room for maneuver because of Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine. And then later, the topic you asked us not to go too deeply into, the fact that Turkey, just like the other 29 member states of NATO, has a veto power over the membership of, in this case, Sweden and Finland. And he mentioned the Kurdish activity in those countries as a concern for Turkey. So to sum it all up, he has a much freer hand than before in striking into Syria, where the Russians, of course, have been a bit less active now that they are obviously focused on the Ukraine, and in Iraq, where the Kurds have an autonomy, but the Baghdad government is powerless to restrain Kurdish activity against Turkey, and Turkey has a security belt in Iraq, has had one for quite some time. It is now trying to probe a bit deeper into Kurdish enclaves.
Indeed. Well, I'd like to start with Mr. Eskizilcik. When we're talking about Turkey's challenges, both on the Iraqi front and Syrian front, and if you could focus initially on the Iraqi front and Yusuf afterwards on the Syrian front, what are the key challenges from Turkey's perspective, both on the border regions where there is presence, according to Turkish statements, of PKK and many other related organizations, and also Iranian organizations which are supporting the PKK, that is, of course, the People's Workers' Party of, or the Communist Party of the Kurds, which has been internationally recognized as a terrorist organization throughout most of the West, including here in Israel. How do you see this dynamic, and does this also put Turkey and Iran on a collision course?
So we have to see that the Turkish position in regards to the Kurds is that Turkey has actually excellent relations with the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and that the Kurdish regional government and their military force, the Kurdish Peshmerga forces, are in active collaboration, coordination, and cooperation with the Turkish armed forces in northern Iraq against the PKK. However, what we have to see is that Turkey has almost finalized to clean the border area and cut off any possible line of the PKK to infiltrate into Turkey. However, further south, the PKK has still important presence, and one of them is the Sinjar mountain region. And we know the further south it goes, the more the role of Iran comes into the play, and that Iranian Shia militias have repeatedly threatened Turkey and have repeatedly attacked, even though minor, Turkish military positions inside Iraq and threatened with an active war. There was even a video propaganda from these Iraqi Shia militias in Turkish, speaking to the Turkish public and arguing, stop your military operations or we will attack Turkey and you will lose out of this. So therefore, this is something the Turks have to deal with. And I anticipate that there's an upcoming competition and upcoming conflict between Turkey and Iran, as Turkey and Iran will compete over influence in Baghdad as well. So we know that after the elections that the Sunnis and the Kurds have won hugely, and Sadr has won, and pro-Iranian political parties have lost important seats. And therefore, if there's a new government in Iraq someday, it takes a very long time, these negotiations. It will be a conflict also between Turkey and a balance of power, in which Turkey will try to ease Iranian influence over Iraq, and Iran will try to curb out Turkey, because from the Iranian perspective, the PKK is a bulwark against Turkish influence inside Iraq. So as I say this always, wherever Turkey is, Iran isn't. Wherever Iran is, Turkey isn't. So therefore, Iran wants to prevent Turkey from pushing the PKK out and from eliminating the PKK, so that Turkey cannot meddle into the Iranian sphere of influence in southern Iraq.
Indeed. Mr. Erim, if you could take also the Syrian angle in this equation, and is the situation in Iraq also mirrored in Syria proper?
Well, I think the situation in Syria now is much more serious because, well, first of all, you have many actors. You don't just have the Syrian central, the Iraqi central government or the KRG administration. You have the Americans, you have the Russians, you have Shiite militia all over there. You have the regime, you have the YPG, you have elements of ISIS and other terror groups as well. So it's a much more complex scenario. You have to, when we're looking at the situation, especially geopolitically, as Amir mentioned before, it's a very conducive situation right now to launch an operation, because you do have a preoccupied Russia. You have a Turkey that has some leverage over NATO right now. So NATO would most likely be more silent than normal. Western countries would be a little more accepting than normal, especially with Turkey bringing the YPG issue to the NATO forefront over the past couple of days, the PKK issue. So if Turkey wants to launch an operation, there's a window of opportunity right now. I think the Turkish president definitely wants to capitalize on that window of opportunity. And frankly, I'm expecting an operation sometime in the month of June. I was expecting an operation even this past weekend. And when we look at one of the reasons why Turkey is hesitating, it still does have to negotiate with Russia. It still has to talk with the Americans. And the YPG in the area is very, very fluid, changing positions, changing uniforms even. There's been a lot of reports that Halloween has come very early to Tel Rifat, and many of the YPG are now putting on regime uniforms, which complicates Turkey's position geopolitically, because that would definitely take the legitimacy away from a Turkish operation, because any Turkish operation is specifically targeting the YPG and has no business with the regime right now.
Mr. Owen?
Well, the Syrian angle, which Yusuf just mentioned, makes it more complex because the Kurds are the main element in the SDF. in the anti-regime forces, which are supported by the Americans. And they are supported by the Americans not because they want to topple Assad. Assad is considered a stabilizing force. They don't like him, but they accept his presence and work for a political settlement, which will degrade some of his power, but will leave him there. Nevertheless, all of the elements, including Israel, are working for some balance of power. And that means that no one, including President Erdogan, has any illusions that one single operation can decimate any group. It's really more of a war of attrition, more of a steady war in which groups are being kept in place. They are kept on the defensive rather than let them act across the border. And we can expect, if not this particular spring offensive, there will be a later one. This is probably going to go on for quite some time.
Mr. Eskizilichik, I'd like to get a little bit of an understanding, and if we establish a mental image, if you will, of the map of northern Syria, President Erdogan spoke about the 30-kilometer security belt throughout Syria, throughout Iraq, of course, is also one of those goals. But when we're talking about 30 kilometers, initial stages, the Manbaj area, Yereblus area, that will then allow it to then expand further to certain other areas. Now, this Manbaj area predominantly is controlled by Shiite militias on the southern front of that, with the Russians, if I'm not mistaken, of course, and there are different operations being taken place by the Russians, including bombardments, which we saw unidentified aircraft, which later it was attributed to the Russian Air Force striking various groups' ammunition depots. Is this something that we're going to see somehow escalate tensions now even more, considering also Turkey's involvement in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia?
So we have to, first of all, just to correct the mistake, you confused Manbij with Tel Rifat.
Right.
Shia militias are present in Tel Rifat, not in Manbij. But what the actual situation on the ground is at the moment like this. In Tel Rifat, we have the Shia militias alongside regime force, the YPG, and Russian military. In Manbij, we have the regime forces, Russian military, and the YPG. In Ain al-Arab, known as Kobane, we have regime, Russia, and the YPG. Ain Issa, Tel Tamer, Amuda, Debasi, all up to Kamishli the same. And only after Kamishli, in to the east, to the Iraqi border, we have the American forces and the YPG up to the south in Deir ez-Zor, where the oil pits are. So the areas we are now speaking about, a possible new military operation, Manbij and Tel Rifat, both of these areas are Arab areas, and they do not have a Kurdish population, except for Manbij, for Kurdish population of 1% or 2%. So therefore, these areas are not part of the Kurdish inhabited territories. And when it comes to a military operation, we have to see that so far the Turkish and the Russian military have been an understanding that Russia do not enter a territory if the Turks are present, and the Turks do not enter territory if the Russians are present. However, so when Turkey launched Operation Olive Branch in Afrin in 2018, the Russians previously withdrew from these areas. But at the moment, we have seen that Russia is, as you said, upgrading its military activity and trying to bolster its presence there by deploying helicopters, heavy weaponry, and fighter jets even. And therefore, it seems like the Russians are opposing this. But here, in the end of the day, this will be something which has to be negotiated between both capitals, and the Russian foreign and defense ministry will come to Turkey, or they are already in Turkey. And these negotiations will determine the fate of this region, because Russia is at the moment in a weak situation. Turkey has cut the straits according to the Montreux Agreement, which deprives Russia of its capability to supply its Syrian military presence via the sea. Turkey has closed its airspace for Russian flights to Syria. So the only logistic line Russia has is via Iran. And this is not a sustainable logistical line. So therefore, the upper hand, there's a new opportunity with Turkey, and this needs to be negotiated.
Nevertheless, this establishes, of course, Iranian leverage over the Russians if the Russians want to maintain a substantive presence in Syria. Mr. Erim, doesn't this create a certain contrasting interest from Turkey's perspective? Because ultimately, where the Russians are, we see only minor presence of the Iranians to a lesser degree, at least, where the Iranians are trying now to fill the void, as has been reported as of late, with regard to certain disengagements of Russian presence in the southern parts of Syria and elsewhere.
Well, first of all, one thing I want to point out is that the Iranian foreign minister was also supposed to visit Ankara this week, along with the Russian foreign minister, but his visit was canceled now. Was this a scheduled conflict? Should we read more into it? Is there some underlying problems between Turkey and Iran that they can't agree on? That remains to be seen. But I think at such a critical time, canceling a top diplomatic visit definitely does signal that there are some disagreements that are holding that meeting back. Now, as for the Russian-Iranian balance inside Syria, at the end of the day, Russia and Iran are both allies in Syria. They do have the same interests of propping up Assad and keeping him in power. And while there is a limited presence of Iranian militia in areas of Russian activity, it doesn't change the fact that they can very comfortably logistically use that territory. And the logistic use of that territory ends up with Syrian opposition paying the price and areas of Turkish influence paying the price as well. So this is something that Turkey doesn't look very kind upon. While the YPG is the number one national security threat to Turkey inside Syria, that doesn't change the fact that Shia militia are the number two national security threat. And they are definitely a growing area of concern as Turkey's threat perception regarding these groups that are loyal to Tehran has definitely drastically changed over 5 years. 5 years ago, they would have been viewed as a nuisance. Now they are being viewed as a very legitimate security threat. And many Turkish military operations have shown that when they bother Turkish national security, that they will be treated as legitimate targets. So yes, the Russian presence in these areas, if they would be removed and Turkey does roll into Tal Rifat and the northern side of Manbij, we can expect a much less of an Iranian presence. Now, I think Manbij is the most significant out of all these areas because of the bridge that crosses the Euphrates connecting the M4 highway. It's a very strategic bridge, and those who hold that bridge have a serious say-so and control over the logistic lines of northern Syria. And if a Turkish operation does take this bridge into its compass, one of the most important parts of taking that bridge would be the Turkish checkpoints that would be created before and afterwards. So any type of terror activity, any type of YPG or Iran-backed militia or ISIS efforts to try to logistically move east to west throughout the country would seriously be hampered by controlling that very serious bit of highway.
Indeed, of course, the highway being east of Manbij, not in Manbij proper. But Mr. Oren, there are a lot of synchronizing interests here between Israel and Turkey. What can you tell us about that?
So obviously, this is common sense. One doesn't need to graduate from Strategy 101 to see that Iran is right now in a hostile position vis-à-vis both Turkey and Israel, which makes the rapprochement of the last several months an obvious platform for security and intelligence cooperation.
If I may interject, of course, this may have some reasoning behind it, but the RGC published a potential route of strikes against Iran by the Israeli Air Force, which then would allegedly go through Turkish-controlled areas in northern Syria rather than elsewhere?
Well, we've been there 20 years ago, and this is a fantasy, much like the Americans found out exactly 20 years ago when Erdogan came to power that their northern route into Iraq is no longer available. So having such routes or even refueling bases is too much to ask for, and Israel can use the southern route. But right now in Israel, we are marking the 40th anniversary of the start of the Lebanon War in June of 1982. And it too started with a security belt, at that time 40 kilometers, not the 30 kilometers which the Turks are talking about. And one lesson everyone, including Turkey, can learn from that debacle is that you can't go 30, 40, 100 kilometers because rockets and missiles always have longer range. So if it will be 30 kilometers south of the Turkish-Syrian border, someone will give the Kurds or whoever longer range missiles. And we've seen right now in the Ukraine that HIMARS and similar rockets, all of which, by the way, derived from the old Katyusha, the old Soviet weapon system, that is going to be more and more available. So there is no sense in striking into a certain number of kilometers. One has to establish dominance, but not necessarily stay there, because there will be terrorist activity against the occupying force. There will be casualties. It will not be domestically sustainable.
Kizilcik, your take on this?
So first of all, I would think that the Turkish position is quite different in contrast to the Israeli position, whereas Turkey is currently working with their local allies and with the Syrian partners. The legitimate Syrian opposition is working together with Turkey and the Syrian interim government, the Syrian National Army. Turkey is conducting the military operation jointly with them, and Turkey enjoys huge popular support among the Syrian society. So being a sustainable presence in northern Syria is possible until a political solution has been reached for Syria. And here again, I also would like to underline that I don't know if Israel wants to strike Iranian militias in Syria or if they plan to, but if they would, they do not need to do it, because the Turkish military has struck and killed Iranian militias in the north with its drone in 2020. And if there's a new military operation towards Tayyip, the Iranian Shia militias, they will all be considered as a legitimate target by Turkey and the Syrian National Army. Secondly, the Syrian partner forces Turkey is working with are actually the most anti-Iranian force on the ground who have fought against Iran more than anyone else. So there is no other force in the Middle East who has killed more Iranian big Shia militias, who has been in a more direct conflict with Iran-backed Shia militias than the Syrian National Army Turkey is working with. And these local Syrians, they hate Iran more than anyone else because Iran has committed many autocracies in Syria. Iran has killed their families, tortured their families, and they see Iran as a national threat to Syria. So therefore, the Turkish position here is quite strong. The main issue Turkey has to face is not Iran, but Russia and the Americans.
Indeed. Mr. Arim, we only have about 3 minutes left, so I'd like to bring NATO into the picture. Obviously, the Syrian front, the last operation that occurred there and a few before that as well, have brought about sanctions against Turkish military exports by Sweden in particular, but also Finland now and Sweden are seeking to join NATO. Turkey is objecting as long as its interests are not in line with this addition. What can you tell us about the Turkish perspective to this, and in a way that our viewers can better understand the complexity from a Turkish perspective?
Well, first of all, Turkey, in principle, has always supported NATO expansion. It supports NATO's open door policy. And Turkey's not against Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Turkey's against countries that support terror groups that threaten Turkey's national security from joining NATO. And that's something that Sweden and Finland do. And I think more so, Turkey's protests are not just aimed at Sweden and Finland, but to the broader alliance as well, because there are alliance members that also provide support to these groups. And I think that by protesting Sweden and Finland and slow walking their membership process, Turkey wants to bring this to the forefront. And I think it's a very opportune time because June 28th and 29th, there is a NATO summit in Madrid. All 30 leaders will be there. The strategic concept document will be finalized at that meeting. And I think Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan wants to see more than assurances. He wants to see guarantees that Turkey's national security will be respected in the future, that these NATO allies will not be putting arms embargoes and sanctions on Turkey in the future for operations for its own national security. So while Turkey has fought shoulder to shoulder with the Americans in Afghanistan, with NATO forces in Kosovo, Bosnia, Korea, you name it, Turkey has been there. Turkey wants to see NATO allies back it up when its national security is under threat. And just one very quick comment about what was being talked about previously. I always thought that Syria was such a missed opportunity for Israel and Turkey to work together. If the relationship was where it was at in the 90s, we would have seen serious coordination and cooperation between both countries. And quite possibly the whole Syrian conflict could have ended much earlier. We would have a totally different landscape. Turkey's never condemned any of the Syrian airstrikes against Iran-backed militia or Syrian positions inside. It's probably quietly applauded it in security circles. And I don't think that Turkey's operations, especially in the Idlib area, especially Euphrates Shield, I don't think that these were condemned in Israeli security circles.
Indeed.
While there might be
Last
some
sentence.
political rhetoric jabbing at Turkey, I don't think that the serious security minds inside Israel really are concerned by what Turkey's doing in Syria.
Indeed. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank Mr. Arim and Mr. Eskizilchik for being part of today's program. I'd like to thank, of course, also Mr. Emil Oren and our viewers. And we will see you next time.